Good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Barrett, Director of the ESRI, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to this morning's webinar. Delighted to say we've close to 200 people logging on, so great to see this level of interest. And I think, as you all know, this morning we're launching work on the issue of child poverty, looking at it on the island of Ireland, and specifically then seeing what lessons can be learned when we compare the two jurisdictions. So let me quickly say that the work that's being presented today, undertaken by my colleagues at the ESRI, but funded by the Shared Island Unit in the Department of the Taoiseach. And again, I think many of you will be aware for the last number of years now, the ESRI and the Shared Island Unit have been engaged in a research programme looking at a whole range of issues on the island of Ireland. And one of the sort of the ambitions, I suppose, of a lot of these projects is to essentially look at the outcomes across a whole range of areas on the island, across the two jurisdictions, and in a sense to try and learn, lessons for policy. We have this unique situation on the island of Ireland of having a relatively similar population, but two jurisdictions. So it's a fascinating way of learning lessons. Today's issue, of course, is an extremely important issue. Actually, from an ESRI perspective, it's one of these issues we've been looking at for many, many years, and there's no doubt great progress has been made on poverty issues generally, but there's a lot that still remains to be done. Again, every time I sort of see the figures on this, I always have a sense of disappointment that we're not making as much progress as we should, and in a sense, apart from the pain and anguish for the kids involved at a point in time, you have that real sort of sense of lost opportunities, because again, some of the material that's come out, for example, the Growing Up in Ireland survey over the years has really shown that disadvantages that begin so early just sort of track people to such an extent throughout their lives that these are often sort of distressing reports and distressing findings. So how we're going to run this morning, in a moment, I'm going to call on my colleague Helen Russell, who will take you through the details of the report. After that, then we've got three panelists from sort of different perspectives who will talk about the report and give some reactions based on their perspectives and experiences. And then once we've had sort of all the speakers, we'll move on to questions then at that stage. So people through the chat function sort of invite you to submit questions, possibly for Helen and the other authors of the report, but also if there's sort of broader comments that want to be made, we'll be delighted to hear them. So with that then, I think my main task is simply to invite my colleague Helen Russell, who will share slides and take you through the details of the report. So Helen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this morning. It's great to see so many people here. So I am just going to share my screen, and hopefully you can see that okay.
Yeah, that's working, Helen.
Is
thanks.
that okay? Great. Thank you very much. Let's see if it moves forward now. There we go. So as Alan really outlined, the motivation for this study really is around the impacts that we know that child poverty has on children, both in the short and long term. Also, they are a group that we know experience a higher risk of poverty compared to other age groups. And that's true in Northern Ireland and in Ireland over the past 10 years and in many other countries. Also, while there has been a good deal of research in Ireland and the UK and in Northern Ireland on child poverty, there's been very little in terms of comparing the two jurisdictions directly. So we're hoping to fill that gap a bit. The report focuses on four main questions. First of all, what are the patterns of child deprivation and child poverty in Northern Ireland and Ireland over time? How do they compare? Secondly, which groups of children are most vulnerable? Does this differ across the two jurisdictions, or is it the same? We then consider what the role of the household labour market situation is in shaping those outcomes. And finally, looking at how the policy approaches to addressing child poverty compare. So how did we do this? The methods here we used were, first of all, a consultation with stakeholders, which we carried out in September. And I know some of the participants in that are here today, and we'd like to thank them all for their input. So they represented different, government departments or agencies, NGOs, and researchers. We also then undertook a quantitative analysis of two nationally representative data sets, the Family Resources Survey in Northern Ireland and the Survey of Income and Living Conditions, SILC, in Ireland. You can see here the number of households that are surveyed in each year. They in Northern Ireland, it's between 700 and 1,700. That low was in the pandemic year. And because the sample is smaller, what we have tended to do in the report is to group years. You'll see, so we're not looking, at a single year in any of the analysis, just to take account of those slightly smaller numbers. So before we jump into all the numbers and statistics, I suppose I'd like to just outline some of the results or some of the issues that the stakeholders highlighted around the experience of poverty for children and their families, what those impacts look like. And that includes food insecurity, being unable to afford healthy, nutritious food, which obviously has health impacts. In the last few years, difficulties around heating and energy costs has been a huge issue, both north and south, and this obviously also has impacts on health. The day-to-day difficulties of juggling between different demands and trying to pay bills was also very real for families, which leads to problems of debt and pressures on mental health of parents, and has consequences for parenting. Additionally, some issues came up for those living in rural areas, that there are additional risk factors, I suppose, around something like lack of access to public transport and services, and this can lead to greater exclusion for children if, so for example, in things like participation in extracurricular activities. And again, there was additional issues highlighted around heating costs in rural areas and lack of choice of energy providers for some of those living in rural areas. So turning to our how we look at poverty in the quantitative study, we take two measures, and the first of these is based on income. So it's the proportion of people with an equivalized household income less than 60% of the national median income. And for that, we have data going back to 2003 all the way up to 2023. We also have a measure of material deprivation, which focuses on people's ability to afford essential items or services that are kind of considered the norm in society. And we have more limited information on this, and we've only got it available from 2010 onwards. And in the two data sets, we were able to identify 5 indicators that were common to both, and these were problems with arrears on your utility bills, being unable to afford to replace worn out furniture, problems with keeping the home adequately warm, unable to have a small amount of personal spending money for the household reference person, and being unable to afford a week's holiday away from home per year. Now, those of you who are very familiar with the Irish indicators of material deprivation will know that these are somewhat different. Obviously, there's 11 of those, and we've only 5 here, and some of the items are different. But we did do robustness checks around the items, and they do load onto the same indicator of material deprivation that we use in the national Irish measure. But we can come back to that discussion in the end if people are interested. So moving to the first research question. So how do the patterns of child income poverty and deprivation differ across the two jurisdictions? So we can see here the blue line is Northern Ireland and the red line is children in Ireland. So these are children under the age of 18. And this is the income measure, income poverty rates. So first of all, we can see that the blue line for Northern Ireland is higher throughout the period. So higher rates of child income poverty throughout. And we can also see, I suppose there's a bit of fluctuation around for Northern Ireland, but no sort of discernible upward or downward trend. In Ireland, we can see a sort of more downward trend over the longer term. Just to say here, as I mentioned, we're doing a 2-year moving average just to smooth out some of that fluctuation. If we look at the child deprivation measure, so again, just to say this is the proportion lacking 2 or more of those items that I showed you. So here we can see a different pattern, that the red line for Ireland is higher than the one for Northern Ireland throughout the period. It's pretty close in this middle period here, and then right at the end we see this convergence in the later period with the rate in Northern Ireland coming up to meet that in Ireland. Again, to just remind you, so we're looking here at a shorter time period. We're starting off here in the recession where there's really very high levels, the declines in the recovery period. So the deprivation measure is much better at picking up those bigger economic changes in people's lives because it's not a relative measure. So because we see this different patterns for the two measures, higher income poverty in Northern Ireland and higher deprivation in Ireland for most of the period. This is suggesting really that households at the same level of income are less able to convert this into an adequate standard of living in Ireland compared to Northern Ireland. And to look at this, we just compared the mean deprivation scores across income quintiles, and you can see here that this is true. So for each income quintile, so for the bottom income quintile, the bottom 25% of the income distribution, you see higher levels of deprivation in Ireland compared to those in Northern Ireland. We see this all the way up, except in the highest income group. So it suggests, that there is higher, I suppose, costs of living issues here in Ireland that are leading to this difference. So particularly, I think housing costs is playing a role here. So turning to the second question of which groups of children are most vulnerable to poverty. Before looking at the risk factors, it's really important, I think, just to look at the characteristics of children north and south, and because this plays into the overall results as well. So this is for all children under 18. And you can see here, so at the top here, we see the proportion of children living in households of different family size. And we see this is very similar across the two jurisdictions. When we look at household type, we see there's a higher proportion of children in Northern Ireland living in a lone parent household, so 22% versus 11% of children. Also a higher proportion of children in Northern Ireland living with someone who has a disability, and a higher proportion living with somebody where the head of a household has no qualifications. So there's this educational difference across the two jurisdictions as well. So turning to which groups are most at risk. So these results here are from models for Northern Ireland and Ireland that are modelled over the whole time period, but controlling for time. And I'm focusing here really on the common findings, because this is, I suppose, what is most striking is that the risk factors are very similar, I suppose, for both. So it's children in large families, so we define here 3+ children, have much higher rates of income poverty and deprivation in both jurisdictions. So for example, if we look at income poverty, a child in a three-child household has a 14 percentage points higher risk of income poverty, higher poverty rate than a child in a one-child household in Northern Ireland. In Ireland, that gap is 12 percentage points. Similarly, we see for lone parent families, that's children in these families at risk in both jurisdictions again, especially in the deprivation rates. So we see here a 27 percentage point gap between the lone parent families and two-parent in Northern Ireland, and a 30 percentage point in Ireland in terms of deprivation. Other common findings were the effect of having a household head who has a low level of education and living in a household where a member has a disability, and that's especially the case in the deprivation measure. In terms of age, we find that older children, so 12 to 17 years, have a high risk for income poverty, but younger children, the youngest age group, less than 5 years, have a higher risk of material deprivation. And I think these different risks for the deprivation measure for disability and younger children really suggest that the income measure isn't fully picking up the additional needs of those households, whereas the deprivation measure is doing so. Additionally, there are groups that aren't sufficiently covered really in the quantitative data for us to highlight, but really the consultation emphasized, the stakeholders emphasized that these are also groups at risk in both jurisdictions. So homeless families, which is rising in both North and South, children in direct provision, children in care or leaving care, and traveller and Roma children. So, as I said, the commonalities and risks is very striking, but there are some differences between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And to look at this, we looked at a joint model, and now this is for the latest period only, and we had fewer. We had more restricted data for this, but nevertheless, we see overall higher rates of income poverty in Northern Ireland compared to Ireland, so 7 percentage points higher. So this is reflecting what we saw in those graphs right at the start. But what we also see is that if we control for, so when we take into account family composition, disability prevalence, educational attainment, so those differences in composition that we saw at the start, actually there's no difference between the two, between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So those differences are being driven by differences in composition, as we showed earlier. And we find so therefore that children with the same characteristics have very similar income poverty risks in both. We did find one difference, I suppose, in terms of the strength of the effect, and that was that lower educational attainment in Ireland has a stronger effect than in Northern Ireland. So I'll just show this in a graph here, so we can see this is the probability of income poverty by the head of household's education. So you can see no qualifications is a risk factor for both, but it's higher here in red for children in Ireland. But otherwise, we found, within characteristics, very similar risks. So for lone parents' children in other households. It's just that there was more children living in those types of households in Northern Ireland. If we turn to the deprivation measure, overall we find no difference in child deprivation between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which is what we saw in the graph as well for the most recent period. But if we look within this characteristics, we see a higher deprivation rate for children in Ireland. So take for example disability. So we saw that children in Northern Ireland are more likely to live with someone with a disability, but when we look at deprivation levels, it's children in Ireland in those circumstances that have a higher deprivation level. So we can see that here in this graph. So the red again is Ireland. So within the characteristics, so these are children living with a person with a disability and without. We see these higher levels. So turning to the third question, so it's around the role of labour market situation of adults in the household. So this is a really important factor and has a really strong influence on outcomes in both jurisdictions. But again, we see a difference in composition. So in Northern Ireland, 15% of children are living in households where no adult has a job, whereas this is 8% in Ireland. So it's a bigger group in Northern Ireland. But we do see that actually, again, joblessness has a stronger impact in Ireland. So the child in a jobless household in Ireland has 3 times the risk of deprivation compared to a child in a working household, whereas in Northern Ireland, it's twice the rate. So stronger effect of joblessness on deprivation, but a higher effect of a higher rate of income poverty, I should say, for those in work in Northern Ireland. So we see here, if we look at the bottom of the graph, where the household head is in employment, and there's a much higher rate of income poverty compared to Ireland. So this suggests that, and again, it's something we see in the literature, higher rates of in-work poverty in the north, linked to higher levels of low pay. So how do policy approaches, this is our final question then, how do they compare in the 2 jurisdictions? We don't really have time to go through the full range of policies. I'm just going to focus on a couple of really important areas. And this comes, I suppose, both from the literature and from the consultation. So first of all, the welfare supports. We have a broadly similar welfare system in the UK and Ireland. We'd be grouped together as liberal welfare states, but there are differences. So, for example, there's higher rates of child benefit in Ireland compared to Northern Ireland, but in Northern Ireland, higher access to means tested benefits, and this is drawing very much on the work of our colleagues, excuse me, Karina Dorley and others in a recent report. In the UK, there was and in Northern Ireland, there's been a strong case made that the reforms from the 2013 onward have had a strong impact on increasing child poverty, especially amongst larger families. And there's 2 aspects to this, to the welfare reform in particular for families with children. One is a benefit cap, which limits the amount of welfare that a household can have. In Northern Ireland, this was offset by a welfare mitigation package. And the stakeholders in Northern Ireland really emphasise the importance of that package in preventing child poverty being even higher. Secondly was the 2-child limit, which again limits the welfare paid to families with more than 2 children. And we've seen here, like this quote on the right, that this has driven rising rates of child poverty in the north. And also the fact that families in Northern Ireland tend to be larger than those in Britain obviously impacts the numbers who are affected. In Ireland, there was very much a discussion around the lack of index linking of benefits, either to inflation or to wages, which has meant that there was a high reliance on temporary measures to address cost of living, but actually that linking it to index linking it in some way would be a more effective way of keeping families out of poverty. Second area, which I'll just briefly touch on, is the education in early years policy. Again, obviously very crucial for children and their families. Cost and availability of childcare is something that comes up in both jurisdictions, especially in our consultation in from Northern Ireland about the childcare costs. School-based supports, I think, were something that were very strongly emphasised as being effective at targeting and reaching children in low-income households very directly. In the north, and the UK, these have are very long-standing back from the early part of the last century. They've had school meals and school books provided. It's more recent in Ireland, and it has recently been made. It has been expanded more universally. So I think that was really welcomed by stakeholders in both jurisdictions, and calls for it to be made universal in Northern Ireland to avoid some of the stigma that can be attached otherwise. And I think again, the importance of early intervention is something that stakeholders also emphasised, and it's something that is really key in the research. So to draw some conclusions, I suppose what we see is very similar groups at risk in both jurisdictions, as outlined there. Also, families are facing common threats, so the cost of living crisis, the rising energy costs, rising homelessness is an issue in both jurisdictions, and rising housing costs, particularly in the private rented sector, is a challenge that families on both sides of the border are facing. Knowing that the composition of the child population in the two jurisdictions is important for understanding the patterns as well, important for the comparisons that we see. In terms of the limitations, obviously there's limitations in the study, and one thing that comes across both in this study and our earlier North-South studies in this program has been the need for better comparable data, particularly around those material deprivation indicators, but also on there's gaps around particularly vulnerable groups like children in direct provision or homeless children, and also we're missing information on ethnicity and other factors that would be useful to explore. In terms of the policy implications, I know we're going to discuss this more with the panel. I think the study really underlines the importance of maintaining the value of the core welfare payments for preventing child poverty, and the need that there's additional needs really that aren't being met according to these results, really, for large families, people with disability and lone parents, that they're still facing these very high risks of poverty and deprivation. And I know work by our colleagues has shown that a second year of means tested child benefit in Ireland would be the most effective means, I suppose, of reducing child poverty with the different measures they compared. Given that joblessness and the employment of the household head and the payment levels of the household head is important, there needs to be policies to address employment and education and training supports, so that people aren't have access to employment where and also that they have access to employment that pays well. And I suppose the other finding from the consultation in particular was the effectiveness of those direct supports in the schools, that they were really reaching the children that they needed to, although there were some issues around the quality of meals and issues like that were raised. Finally, I think the report emphasizes the importance of political will, the need for targets and strategies in this area. So in Ireland, we've had poverty strategy, and there have been targets for child poverty, but these the deadline for reaching these has been pushed out, and we really need new child poverty targets. In Northern Ireland, the anti-poverty strategy is promised, but it's been very long awaited, and that was something that the consultation really emphasized as well. So I'm going to finish on that and hand over to our panelists.
Well, actually, Helen, before you do hand over to the
Yeah.
panelists, I'm just going to ask a really, really quick question, right? And then
just end.
Okay. Let me put it like this. Before you did this analysis, okay, I intuitively, okay, I would have thought we would have seen higher child poverty in Northern Ireland, okay, because of the 2 children cap that comes from the UK welfare system. Okay, so now I have to say again in regard to that, I think I only heard about the 2-child cap during the British general election. Okay, this was a policy I hadn't been aware of, and I think for a lot it came as a sort of something of a surprise. So can I just ask, were you surprised in a sense that that didn't seem to have more of an impact in terms of driving greater differences between child poverty rates in Ireland and Northern Ireland? And then I'm also interested in the extent to which it came up in your consultations in order that this is a policy that in a sense is really biting. And I was struck by what you said, that because family size is bigger in Northern Ireland, that there is a differential impact in Northern Ireland compared to GB. So just a couple of reflections on that. If you...
Yes, and it was something that I think nearly every stakeholder from Northern Ireland mentioned this as being a factor, the 2-child limit as being a factor influencing in poverty in Northern Ireland, and the evidence from the UK is pretty robust as well, that the rising poverty levels there for children has been really driven by larger families and also lone parent families. So yes, it does have an effect, and we are seeing that in the results here. But equally, we're seeing that children in large households in Ireland are also have a high risk of poverty. So I think maybe it's we're somehow maybe not focused so much on the risks of large families in Ireland anymore. There used to be an additional benefit, like child benefit payment for larger families, which we got rid of. So I think it's maybe gone off the radar a bit in the Republic. Yeah, I think, when you said where we expected those differences, so there is maybe the income poverty differences. We see it is higher in Northern Ireland for children. But the deprivation ones are the other way around, as we saw. I think there's such a wide range of factors going into that. Alan, is so yes, we might have expected it to be higher, but I think we're talking about the cost of living, comparing the house prices in Northern Ireland and Ireland. There's significant differences in there. There's differences in the provision of services, which we can't really quantify in the study, or we don't decompose it. But I think they are likely to be playing a role there again in the higher deprivation levels in Ireland. But
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to our panelists now. Let me just say to all our audience, which is now actually over 250, so great to see so many people logged on. Delighted to say we've three notable people and experts in the area. So Niall Muldoon, who's the Ombudsman for Children here in the Republic. Goretti Horgan is Senior Lecturer in Social Policy in Ulster University, and Jerome Finnegan is Senior Policy and Advocacy Advisor with Save the Children UK. So we've asked each to essentially pretty free rein, just give us a reaction. So Niall, you're listed first on my list. So would you like to kick off with some thoughts and reflections?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks a million, Alan. First of all, thanks a million for the invitation, and congratulations to the reporters, to Helen, Anusha, and Bertrand, because it is a really powerful piece of work and very important for us to have that comparison. We had a meeting yesterday with my colleagues from Northern Irish Children's Commissioner, so this is really vital to be able to talk in the same language around child poverty and the issues around it. And again, as we talk about it, we just remind people that, you know, we as a nation have always prided ourselves in trying to be good for children. We've had various time targets from different Taoiseach, from the best small country in the world to be a child to the best country in Europe to be a child. We're constantly trying to sell that message. But we've signed up to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1992. So they have the right to shelter. They have the right to safety from harm. They have the right to education. Children have the right to reach their potential, to thrive and survive. And every one of those rights are being compromised through poverty. So the more information we have with this, it's so important. We've also, you know, I mean, for me, the main findings that it's great is not the right word, but it's important to know that the cohorts are the same, fairly much the same. That idea of the single parents, families, the bigger families, disability, and also the low education. But the one that really stood out for me was like a sore thumb, and again, perhaps it's my lack of in-depth knowledge of this work, was that Irish children in jobless households are 5.4 times more likely to be income poor than Northern Ireland. You know, I mean, that's just incredible. Because again, what you said and Helen said, it's better, I think, that I quoted right. Essentially, it means that when you're in unemployment, the money that you get here in Ireland doesn't stretch anywhere near as far as it does in Northern Ireland. And that's something we can fix, because that's policy. That's providing services that are cheaper, providing services that are done free for certain areas, certain groups of children and families. And it's something we can really work on. But that gap was just something I'd never thought would be the case. And again, we know we've set poverty targets here in Ireland. I think they're nearly a decade old now. I think the last one I remember, 70,000 children to come out of poverty, and that was back in 2016. And I remember writing to the UN Committee of the Rights of the Child at that stage to say that that wasn't sufficient. But yet, I don't think we've reached that target yet. So there's a lot of work to be done. As regards to policy responses, I think, again, for me, a number of things just stand out. The low education one was one I think we really need to look at. For me, again, if you go upstream, you're looking at these children, and you, again, the data says from the report that older children are an increased risk for income poverty. So these are the sort of 12 to 18-year-olds, which in turn we also know are the children who are more likely to end up in care, more likely are starting to end up in care more than ever before, also starting to be brought into criminality more often, fall out of education. So for me, again, if we start to focus our areas on children at risk in education, and again, we have a system in place, but we haven't really focused on it and resourced the way it should be. We know that Leaving Cert the Irish education system is top class, world class. 92% of our children in Ireland get through, finish the Leaving Cert, but within disadvantaged areas, it's only really 6%. So those are the children, that 14% of the children who are likely to end up leading households of low income with low education and completing the cycle. So we really have an opportunity here with this data to say we really need the Department of Education, welfare services to make sure those children can get through their education properly. So we may need to adjust our education system. It doesn't have to be as academic and as formal. Maybe there's other ways of making sure these children get to apprenticeships, get to wherever they need to go. But this data really helps us to focus on that and to say that those 16 or those 14% of children from the disadvantaged areas need much more support to get that educational attainment that will help them in the future. The other piece for me again is the childcare moves. The new government and the government program of government today is talking about bringing down childcare to €200 a month. Excellent idea. Let's make sure that these families that are in poverty or in deprivation don't get caught in the poverty trap where the childcare is not 5 days a week. It's not secure for them. They get a 3.5-day week and they have to use childcare in the way they should be. All those sorts of areas need to be clarified now so that we don't end up in situations where people who could take on a job don't take it on. So we have an opportunity to do that in this next 5 years. I think around that area, you're looking at the second tier means test that Helen talked about, and that really needs to be considered very strongly. And we're delighted, just got a manage to look at the program of government this morning. the government are retaining the Child Poverty and Wellbeing Programme Office within the Department of Taoiseach. So we really will have a focus for the next 5 years. They've done a great job in the last 18 months to 2 years to get that up and running. It's great to retain that, and with this data and with this information, we can really make a difference over the next 5 years of this government. And the final piece for me is we're starting a program now to try and go upstream in all of our ways of seeing children's rights, and we want to try and we've been asking all the parties to look at incorporating the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into law, so that ultimately we will have a situation, if we can do that, that every government agency, no matter whether they deal directly or not with children, will have to consider that every decision they make is child right compliant, and that over a period of 10, 12 years, 20 years could change the way we produce systems and services for all of our students, all of our citizens, but especially for our children. So hopefully we can get that into place over the next 5, 10 years. We would start to see a real difference. But from my point of view, thank you so much for a really important piece of work, and I look forward to engaging with my colleagues in Northern Ireland as well.
Great, thanks so much for that, Niles. Obviously, stay with us, and I'm sure you'll sort of pitch in on some of the questions. And just as I mentioned, questions, some are coming in the Q&A function already, so people should feel free to submit them. We'll try and get to as many as possible, and if we don't, there's always the possibility of we'll give the questions to the contributors, and they may be able to email responses. Goretti, you're next on my list of contributors. So would you like to turn on the camera and mic, and we'll get your reflections? I don't know if you're talking or not, Goretti. We certainly can't hear you. Okay, I'll tell you what, we better move on to Jerome. Oh, that's okay with you, Jerome. Sorry for dropping you right in it. And I don't know if our colleagues in Atlantic Audio can contact Goretti to see if it's possible to just one tip, Goretti, of when people run into these, if you're listening, if you try to log on the phone, things might work.
Yeah, no, I think
brilliant. Now we can see you and hear you, I think. No, I tell you what, let's Jerome, if you don't mind coming in at this stage, and then as at Atlantic Audio, maybe if you just contact Goretti to see what the best way of getting a sort of a stable connection. So Jerome.
Sure, thanks, Alan. And just echoing, thanks for the invitation to be on the panel and for the report itself. I was going to share 3 broad reflections. And I think the starting point to that for me and Save the Children and the work that we do and others do, when I first heard about the report, I kind of felt a sense of relief, because I think anyone who works across the island of Ireland around these issues knows there's lots of relationships, there's lots of connections, there's lots of knowledge, expertise, and experience of working on child poverty, working with families, working in communities. But I think one of the gaps has been around this type of research that's robust, that's doing comparative, that's looking at the differences, but also the similarities. And I think what it's doing is giving people a steer on areas where they can come around those connections and look at where they can do more work together to share learning, knowledge, and expertise to how we address these problems locally and nationally. And I wanted to highlight that because I think, and echoing what Niall has said about, our perspective on poverty is equally that it is about a barrier to children's rights. And it is fundamentally a challenge to their rights as well. So the realization of children's rights requires the ending of child poverty. But to get to that place, you can't do it on your own. No organization can do it, no government can do it. It is fundamentally, we think about the connections, the relationships, and bringing people together around this issue and looking at how they can learn and work together to address it. It's a very kind of broad point, but I think it's a real value of the report in terms of putting some markers down around where people can come together and do further collaboration, sharing, and learning approaches. I think there's a lot in the report we could get into. Be happy to pick up the point about the 2-child limit as well, maybe later on. But I suppose another reflection or coming away from the report was, I think a real value in it is not focusing solely on the headline rate of child poverty and the comparisons between that. I think the rate is very helpful in telling you there's a problem, the level of the problem, and gives you an indication of some of the solutions. But I think anyone who works with families or is in a family, or indeed the work we would do with families in Northern Ireland, knows that families are different and the challenges and barriers they face to moving out of poverty are different. And I think, as Niall has also commented on, like, what it's very clear from this report is what we know from the data in terms of the families most at risk. So whether that's about larger families, it's families where children or parents have a health condition or disability, single parents, particular challenges around the labour market. These are the issues that we would see come up continuously when we're working directly with families. It's not necessary, there are one-size-fits-all approaches, but I think the approach to solving poverty is also starting from the position of families and children now, and trying to work with them in addressing those different challenges and barriers. And that's incredibly complicated. That's not a simple solution to that. But I think the value of the report, again, is it's directing you towards the reality of children and families' lives, the differences, and is informing how you approach. And equally, I would say, just on that point, I think, again, to the credit of the report, it's very clear about who's not included in the data, and that's not a limitation of the report, but it's a limitation of the data. And those are the groups of families and children and communities that, again, we would see in our work who we would think are most likely to be at risk of poverty. While I don't have the statistic, I'm very confident to say that you're more likely to see poverty because of wider inequalities in society around traveller communities, or homeless children, or in migrant communities. And that invisibility of those families and communities in the discussion, particularly in Northern Ireland, is a real challenge in actually making progress on this issue, particularly for children who are most at risk. And that will kind of bring me on to a third point. I think the policy implications are massive. There's a lot. And I think because it's child poverty and it cuts across so many areas, there's a lot of ways we could take it. I think one area I just wanted to pull out, though, was around childcare and early education. And more as an example about how this report, I think, can contribute to a discussion about how can you improve policies and services for children in Northern Ireland, and indeed elsewhere as well. Because in Northern Ireland, we essentially saw, compared to the rest of the UK and indeed Ireland, no real investment in childcare and early education for about 20 years. Comparably, where you have rollout of free hours in England, Scotland, and Wales, and we had a changing system in Ireland as well, there was just no progress. Now, to its credit, the Department of Education, the Minister last year, did make a significant investment in childcare and early education. And it's definitely not the end of that journey. And the new policies that set up are not where you want to be at the end in terms of reducing poverty. But I think the decision it did make was to introduce a system which is about not extending the free hours model that you see in England, Scotland, and Wales, but introducing a payment that reduces the cost of childcare at the point of use for families. And that's quite a different approach, but it's also one that's quite similar to, as I understand it, the journey that Ireland's been on over the last decade in terms of childcare and early learning. From our perspective, again, what that's pointing you to is an opportunity to share and learn and look at how you can take lessons in terms of policy implementation over the last decade in Ireland to inform how that policy might develop in Northern Ireland. And in saying that, we would say that's not about a like-for-like transfer. Again, sitting in the context, thinking about how you can take that learning to improve the system for children and their families in Northern Ireland. As I say, there's a lot you could talk about on the policy side, but I just wanted to end there and just say thank you so much for the report, invitation. It's really a fantastic piece of work.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Jerome. And again, stay with us, and I'm sure we'll come back to you with questions. So, Goretti, are the IT issues sorted?
Yeah, I hope that we're okay.
No, we can hear and see you, so it's all sounding good. So you're very welcome to the discussion. Thanks. And look forward to your remarks.
Okay, so my internet is very unstable, so I hope it lasts. I like yourself, Alan, I was quite surprised by some of the findings, particularly in relation to, the fact that material deprivation is worse in the Republic. But then when I thought about it, you could see how it makes sense because of the cost of living, and particularly housing costs in the Republic are so much higher than they are in the North. But I think that what your findings also show is the importance of the mitigations here in Northern Ireland, where actually until 2017, well, until actually maybe 2018 or 19, our child poverty figures were among the best in the UK. And the two-child policy has only started to affect us. And we can see that year on year, it's actually impacting families and the statistics more, because it's not every third child in a household who doesn't have any state support. It's the third and subsequent children born since April of 2017. So that means that, you know, each year now we have a new cohort of children being born who are not getting the support that they ought to from the state, and that they ought to under the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. So that's definitely part of it. Then there's also the issue of the housing costs are, I really worry about what's going to happen in the future, because housing costs in the North are, particularly in the private rented sector, are going up so quickly at the moment. And the number of children in temporary accommodation in the North has pretty much doubled in the last 18 months. To over 5,500. So there are more, in absolute terms, more children in temporary accommodation in the North, there's 5,500 of them in temporary accommodation in the North than there are in the South. And actually some of the conditions that they're living under in that temporary accommodation are worse than they would be if there were children in temporary accommodation in the Republic. And that is absolutely, it's kind of scandalous, actually. It is the biggest scandal, actually, in Northern Ireland, I think. So I really fear that if we come back and revisit this in 2 years' time, that actually things will have unfortunately evened out in the wrong way, insofar as the children in the North will be suffering the kind of material deprivation that children in the Republic do at the minute. So that was my main thought coming from it. I think that childcare has something to do with it as well, not only in the fact that childcare is, I mean, because childcare is incredible.
Oh, that's really irritating now. Greta was in full flight, and we're missing. Okay, look, I think what we'll do, hopefully she comes back and maybe we'll have the opportunity. If I was
Have I gone again? Did I go again?
We lost you a little bit, say about the last 30 seconds or so. I was about to say, you know, if I was presenting Morning Ireland, I'd say we'd cut to a commercial break or something like that. So that wasn't, it was that or ask Niall Muldoon to sing a song or something like that. But listen, you're back again. So we missed about 30 seconds. So if you kind of want to just go back to the start of the thought or whatever like that.
Okay, I think I was talking about childcare. It's about childcare. Yeah, so exactly. we need to do a bit more research about this. But my observation, because I'm from the Republic, even though I've lived in the North for 40 odd years now, my impression is that there's far more use of informal childcare in the North than there is in the Republic. And that's probably got to do with the size of cities and stuff like that, and, you know, kind of community stuff. So we don't have some of the kind of community-based childcare that there has been in the Republic. Sure Start here is like, so it's only for the very poorest of children. But yeah, so I think the childcare also the cost of childcare up here may not be borne as much by poorer families who rely far more on grannies, frankly. So, but I mean, I totally agree with what others have said. It's a really important piece of work, and I really hope that it will be revisited in a couple of years. And it's a very important addition to what we know about child poverty on the island.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Greta. And actually, you've really filled out my understanding of the two-child limit. Helen, did you want to come back in again? And then I was just
on the childcare aspect there, because we did do a study previously with the Shared Island Unit as well, looking at the childcare North and South, and that was precisely what we found, Greta, was the greater use of informal childcare in Northern Ireland. You know, and we also found you know, more part-time work amongst mothers of young children in Northern Ireland? So is this getting again to this issue of low pay and in-work poverty for that particular group? And also, I suppose the study also echoed really what Jerome was saying about, you know, there's been a lot of policy development on childcare in the Republic over the last 10, 15 years. I mean, we were starting from a very, very low base, but there has been a lot of development, whereas in Northern Ireland, there was really a sense that a lot of the progress had been stalled and hadn't kept up with even what was going on in the UK, like even in terms of the free preschool year, you know, that was expanded elsewhere in the UK, but not in Northern Ireland. So there was, there was a real sense of frustration, I think, that there was you know, a strategy that had been childcare strategy that had been consulted about but hadn't been sort of followed through. So that very much echoes what we did find.
Exactly. Okay, look, let's try and move to some of the questions that have been raised. And I think the simplest thing is people have just emailed them in. So I'll read them out. And see, Bertrand has joined us, which is great. And Anusha, if you'd like to join us as well, you're very welcome to do so. So first question then from Amy Healy. And like I said, I'll just read it. A consistent weakness of Irish poverty research is the fact that the existing survey data excludes those who are arguably the most likely to be at risk of poverty, the homeless, those in direct provision, and travellers stroke Roma. Are there plans to change the mode of data collection to deal with these weaknesses? So again, this is a theme that has been brought up. So I don't know, Helen, is that one or anybody else? Are any plans to change this?
Well, I mean, I think we still need the large scale quantitative data about quality of life and the standard of living and income across the population. I would very much like to see, that those sample sizes, if they were increased, and if there was booster samples of certain disadvantaged groups, that would certainly help. I know we've discussed some of that in the past with CSO, but I haven't seen that. I think maybe some of the administrative data initiatives that CSO have taken may be a solution for some of that data. You know, if you're relying on revenue data or DSP data, then you can obviously have a much larger base, so you can then focus in on you know, smaller groups, you know, like sure. Smaller groups in the population, say like of different ethnicity or different you know, traveller Roma, but you actually then have to have that identifier somewhere else in the system so that you can match it on. So yeah, I think the administrative data can be partly a solution. I think there's also a need for more of the qualitative research piece as well, and so I think the two things need to go hand in hand. I mean, we tried a bit here in terms of getting the consultation to bring in more of that experience of the other vulnerable groups, which we know are out there but are not in the data in sufficient numbers for us to analyze.
Sure. Now, Siobhan Harding, sorry, Jerome, I'll just come back to you in a second. I just want to get to 3 or 4 a block of questions, if I can, just to make sure the folks online feel voices are being heard. So Siobhan Harding makes the point, which Greta, you made earlier. As time goes on, the 2-child limit will have increasing impacts, so will continue to impact on poverty levels. So again, a point that you've made. Tony Gallagher has another point, and actually, Goretti, you may be best placed to answer this one. Annual J or F, I presume that's Joseph Rowntree Foundation, reports in poverty in the UK suggest the mitigations applied in Northern Ireland have tempered the impact of some of the austerity measures imposed by the UK government in recent years. So does that, I see you nodding your head, Goretti, does that make sense anyway, and that there have been mitigations?
Yes, so basically when welfare reform was brought in 2015, the Stormont government agreed to a package of mitigations that means that the benefit cap, which applies in Britain, doesn't apply in Northern Ireland, and that the bedroom tax, which really has driven poverty in Britain, in the rest of the UK, that the benefit tax is also mitigated. And these mitigations, it's been agreed by the current government, should continue in March. It's not signed, sealed, and delivered yet, so we're all still kind of keeping our fingers crossed. But it would be perverse if they weren't to, given the the excellent the real difference that they've made in terms of our poverty figures, and obviously in terms of policy asks. Everybody who works with children would be asking that the two-child policy would also be mitigated, although they've said they won't do that. But definitely the mitigations, it is really clear, as Tony says, if you look at the annual reporting on poverty across the UK, that the mitigations have made a big difference in Northern Ireland. And I mean, the bedroom tax is mitigated for everybody. That for everybody in social housing, and that actually has made a huge difference.
Okay, great, thank you for that. So next question from Nessun Vaughan. There's actually two bits to this, Helen, so I'll run them by you. So the first is your view, Helen, is income poverty or material deprivation, let's see, more significant in terms of impact on children affected? Yeah, what in terms of impacts, okay, should we worry more about income poverty or material deprivation?
I mean, I think they're both important. The income measure, I suppose, is telling you what disposable income that the household has to spend on their needs. But we know that there are limitations to that, and it's really useful in terms of comparing across countries and whatever to have that 60% median income. So you're talking people are really considerably below the average for the society. So it is telling you something about their relative position. But I think the material deprivation sort of tap in more directly to the impacts, and takes into account some of the differences in needs, or picks up on the differences in needs that you don't get with the income. So as I said, people with a disability, on the same income cannot reach the same standard of living because they have additional needs and expenses. Similarly, we saw that with the young children. So I know in Ireland the approach has been to try and look at both and combine them. I think they do both tell us important things about the circumstances of families. Okay,
so Nelson's second. Oh, Bertrand, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say just one thing about the measure of material deprivation as well. This is a measure that really captures really very quickly any change in the economy. For example, we saw that in Ireland with the recession, that straight away, the level of material deprivation increased rapidly. But in fact, because the average household income, was falling across the whole population, so there was no increase really in at-risk poverty. So at least, the measure of material deprivation is able to pick up straight away any change in the economy. So I think it's a different measure, but it's useful to have both. But the measure of deprivation, is really, capturing what's going on, in real time in a way, in the economy.
Sure. And thanks for that. And Helen, second part of Nelson's question, probably slightly beyond the current study, but Nelson is asking, did the study confirm any of the findings on intergenerational poverty? Now, I guess you haven't looked at it in this.
No, we haven't looked at it in this. I think that would be an interesting one that we could. The study we did do, showed this very strong link between your poverty in childhood and in your life as an adult. So it would be possible to look across, UK and Ireland. I don't think Northern Ireland we'd be able to do it, but certainly there. And it did come up in the consultations, when people were talking about very deprived communities where children were living in families where there had been that intergenerational disadvantage for their parents as well. And then probably we see it a bit in the low education of the parent, that's impacting.
No, Jerome, I haven't forgotten about you. I know you wanted to come in, or do you want to come in now anyway, and then we'll move back to the questions?
Yeah, happy to. I might just pick up 2 points, just to pick up the question on mitigations and the points Garetti made. Just to echo that, I think when you put Northern Ireland in a UK context, what you see is the mitigations have played a role. but equally housing costs have played a role. And I think the risk is the protective factor of those reducing poverty are being eroded, because you've got higher housing costs, you've got two-child limit, you've got other factors coming into play, which means that you're very likely to see the protection fall away, and the risk is you're going to see an increase in poverty because policy is not keeping up with the changing context. And then just really briefly to go back to the point about communities and groups of children who are not included in the data, it's certainly a weakness in the data. I don't think it's a weakness of the report. Again, I would say you often read reports and it's not even acknowledged. I think it's a strength of the report to headline this and put it front and center. But equally, and I think I saw this in the chat from Siobhan, I don't think survey data should slow down action on this. I think in practice, there's a lot of information, insight, and knowledge out there, not just from families and communities, but charities and others as well. And there's a lot that can be done in the short term in terms of working together to generate research and insight and evidence into some of the challenges and driving factors there, and to try and take policy steps that will address those things. Like even very simply, we've been talking to some of the migrant community organisations in Northern Ireland, and very clearly things that come up are things like policies like no recourse to public funds, which limits access to the welfare system for migrant families. And that automatically puts a family who's more likely to be in low-paid employment as well at a much higher risk of poverty. And so that, you don't need the survey data to know that that is a problem and it's driving poverty. So there's action that can be taken. It is important that the data needs to be there, but there's other kinds of data and evidence that should be informing how we approach it and respond to it.
Thanks for that. There's a comment from Jenny Liston, which I'll read because it's related to what we've just been talking about. So thanks for an interesting presentation on your findings and for acknowledging again the limitations in the research in terms of particularly marginalized groups such as travellers, Roma and children in direct provision. However, I think the key finding that core welfare payments are integral to combating child poverty really highlights the dire situation of children in direct provision and Roma children not deemed habitually resident. Who are currently excluded from basic social protections, including child benefit. Yeah, actually, on the habitually resident, I guess that's the Department of Social Protection sort of criteria for access, on which I did a study many years ago. So it rings a bell, and that's a very fair point, Jenny. Helen, one for you, or Bertrand or Anusha. Jonathan Bradshaw asking, did you manage to do child poverty before and after transfers? I'm guessing not, but do you want to address that?
No, we didn't look at that issue. I think indeed it would be very good to do that, just to see the impact of social transfers in lifting children out of poverty. But no, we didn't do that. But it's something that maybe we could explore in the future. Yeah.
Okay, then an anonymous attendee, but I'll read. Hi all, thanks so much for presenting the research, really interesting stuff, so congrats to the authors. My question is, we know from the 2022 census that travellers are a young population with 30% of the community being under 15, and generally speaking there's well documented higher levels of poverty within the community across accommodation, healthcare and education. So why is there no qualitative data available for travellers or other ethnic minorities? I mean, I think we probably addressed that one already, so I think the point is well taken, and clearly more needs to be done on this. Philip Clark question, and the question is, any research on refinancing poverty? So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation costed poverty in UK at 80 billion. For example, minimum guaranteed household income. So poverty is costly for society. So again, I think, you haven't in this sort of, I think, looked at the cost of poverty as such. So I think we'll take the point, but unless people want to address it, we'll keep moving. So another anonymous attendee. So the slide on poverty measures stated that this was based on 60% of national median income. Okay, so that's standard measure. This percentage is similar to the working family payment calculation. Was that the intention? Just why it's based on 60% of national median income? What does the figure represent, and where does it come from? So yeah, I mean, that's actually an interesting one. Why 60%? And is there ever a sense in which welfare payments are sort of adjusted just to get people above that line?
Yeah, I mean, it is the conventional line that we use sort of in the national poverty measure in Ireland. So that's why we applied this one here. I think, you know, in some of our work, we would look at the putting different thresholds there, and trying to look at the depth of poverty. I know work that Barra and Barra Rowntree and Karina did and recently have looked at that as well, and there is a sense of, yeah, people being just below the or just above the poverty line. Actually, what you may find is that you pick them up on the deprivation measure, you know, so they might not be defined then as being in consistent poverty, but you would pick them up on deprivation. So because they're just above that sort of arbitrary threshold, in a way, it is just arbitrary, and you could apply different lines at 50% or 70%, but that one is the one that tends to be used most widely.
Okay. Question from Grania Collins. Grania, old friend of the ESRI. So to you, Helen, is the equivalence scale the same in both jurisdictions? And do we now need to start thinking about a U-shaped curve where we take into account the increased costs in the first 2 to 3 years of a child's life? So that's always a complicated one around equivalent of scales and how you adjust for sort of family.
We did harmonise. I'll let Bertrand answer that one. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah, I think in the UK, you know, the scale is different to the one that we use in Ireland. In Ireland, it's really quite specific to Ireland. It's different again from the one used, you know, by the OECD, for example. So we harmonise the scale so that indeed the scale being used, you know, the equivalence, you know, household income is the same. But anyway, because we're talking about relativities within countries, so it doesn't really matter in a way. But the scale have been exactly, you know, the same.
Okay, thanks for that. Actually,
but I mean, sorry, just to the substantive point, I suppose it is, yeah, there is this issue for the very young group that it was, you know, that again we were picking up higher deprivation, but that they weren't for the children under 5, but you weren't seeing that for income, which suggests there could be adjustment. There has been, again, work by other colleagues here at the ESRI who have looked at those equivalent scales in great detail. And if anyone is interested in those, I can certainly send on that paper.
Great, thanks for that. But before we move on, Niall, can I just ask a question of you? And it's something you mentioned in your remarks, and I'd just like to come back to it. I'm always interested in this notion where people have rights that are recognized, say, under UN conventions. But I'm often confused as to how impactful are those rights in a real sense. Okay, and obviously this discussion has come up. Remember the notion, like, should we have a right to housing in the Constitution, and should older people have a right to guaranteed care services, whatever like that. So this is and I'm just wondering, in your job and in your daily interactions, I mean, does it strengthen your position when you talk to politicians about these sort of issues and you make reference to the rights, or is that sort of considered fluffy stuff? You know what I mean? That's not for sort of practical people.
I think it's a great question, Alan. I think essentially it's in between. The Ireland does respect the UN Convention on Rights of the Child. You know, we ratified it over 30 odd years ago. We do work hard at it, but it isn't a driving factor all the time. I think that's the piece for me, is it's not a central consideration for every department. So again, the Department of Children or the Department of Housing, the Department of Home, people involved with homes have no law that says we have to consider children. The local authority have to consider the owner of the house and anyone who's subject to his, anyone under his guise. So essentially the chattels. So children aren't a consideration when you're assessing homelessness at this moment in time. It's not in the law. So it's those sort of, we need to consistently keep building up the idea that children's rights is for everybody across the government. And that's the reason we are trying to now move in the direction of trying to get the UN Convention on Rights of the Child incorporated, so that the local authority manager in Donegal, who has 50,000 euros to put in the potholes, will decide to put it on this road or to put it outside the schools. If you're thinking children's rights, you'll think about schools quicker. And it becomes a standard practice across the way. And the way at this moment in time we assess environmental decisions based on, you know, what's going on for snails or for birds or whatever it is, we do an assessment, an impact assessment. We don't do that for children in the decisions we make. We don't know how much money is spent on children in our health system. I mean, imagine 23 billion euros in spent, and they can't say how much is spent on children. And the reason they do that is to keep the flexibility, so that if there's money left over from children, we put it into waiting lists, we put it into beds, we put it into surgery. That's not appropriate. So the reality again is, there's no jurisprudence isn't there, so that obviously has strength. At times it scares some people, but it also drives, motivates decisions as well. So we're currently working on a sort of moral suasion scenario, and it works well because we have reasonably good people a lot of the time working on it. But we know Europe and the world is changing. If we have the wrong people at the head of the government, children's rights could disappear very fast. So it's really important that we start to look at this and put it into our legislation in a much better way, because it allows people off the hook. You know, local authorities, what they've done for housing has been less than it should have been. You know, 10, 15 years ago, they would have been in control of every local housing, building more and more and more. They've avoided all that, you know, because there's nothing in the legislation that said they have to concern themselves with children. They have to concern themselves with the owner of a house or the head of a household. And the children are not important. So that child has a disability, has a mental health issue, whatever it might be, it's not considered the way it should be. So we still have a long way to go.
Great, thanks for that. So curious about it. So it's good to have the opportunity to actually ask you about it. We'll go back to the Q&A, and actually I found the next question very interesting. They're all interesting, but this one just grabbed my attention. So again, an anonymous attendee. So recently it was reported that school meals in Ireland are of poor nutritional quality, an issue that has been flagged in the UK also. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know, but I think the questioner is right in saying that people have raised this question. What evidence is there of the benefit of feeding children poor quality food compared to ensuring parents can afford to feed their children? Particularly in the context of claims around holiday poverty. So I find the question interesting because it's one of these issues again, are we better providing stuff, in this case meals, or are we better providing money? And then let parents, and again, Helen Bertrand, you can answer that in the context of this All Ireland study or your sort of broader experience, but it's just always a fascinating core question that I think comes up.
Yeah, no, right. It's a good question. And I mean, we are going to be doing some more work on it as well, because, you know, I think if you translated the amount spent on school meals into the amount of, you know, how much each family would get if you put it onto their income, you know, you'd be talking about a couple of quid a week or something, you know, so that's not going to make a difference in terms of income poverty for that. That's certainly not going to lift many people above the poverty line, whereas providing the food directly to children, I mean, it was, as I say, I haven't done the study, but certainly what other people, researchers have said, and the NGOs, people working in the area, is that has a really positive impact, that it's getting children into school in the mornings. It's giving children food maybe in the mornings that they wouldn't otherwise have, and that helps with a whole lot of other things like their concentration and focus. Yeah, as I say, even attendance and retaining them at school, which is a really, really important effect as well. There was a big study, a big evaluation, and I can't remember the name of the authors now, very recently. So again, in Ireland. So I think that is worth it's worth looking. And again, that had you know, suggested it was very positive outcomes for the children. So that would be my take on it, is that probably for the amount of money that's spent, it's effective. I do take on board those issues about poor quality food. That obviously has to be important. And it seems that the schools that were in the system longer were able to negotiate that better, you know. So maybe in their first, you know, they tried with different providers. The problem is in Irish schools, they're not producing food on site, don't have kitchens, whatever, so they're buying it in. So there was a bit of trial and error, I think, around getting good quality meals, and there are standards around it. But yeah, I absolutely acknowledge there could be issues around quality.
Okay. Greta, you want to come in?
Yeah, can I just say there, I mean, Jerome probably knows more about this than I do, but there is a lot of evidence from the UK that providing children with food in school does actually have like a real impact on their learning and on their mental health generally. So the evidence is there for universal school meals. And the cost, as Helen said, the cost is actually it's less than what it would be to ask a family to provide the same kind of food for them. So you know, it is seen as something that does actually make a real difference to the individual children, and as a result of that, like to their health.
Okay, comment from Deirdre McAlliskey, talking about the report highlighting the interrelational and interdependency of children's rights and the continued failure at state level to demonstrate either its intention or ability to protect the best interests of children in its decision-making and allocation of resources. Again, further from Deirdre, children and families can only benefit from services or interventions they receive. Access to advice services are therefore key in maximising income and minimising debt. A what work study would be a very welcome follow-up to this report. So again, I think we'll take that as a comment. Now, another anonymous attendee, there appears to be limited evidence that legislating for policy outcomes produces effective policy, and what evidence there is tends to be associated with developing nations. And what is the utility of prioritizing such approaches here? So again, I suppose that's just the question, as I interpret it, of having targets or whatever like that, which are perhaps not entirely backed up on occasions with actions or whatever. So I'm assuming that's the sort of the sense of the comment that's been made. Okay, let's look at another. Sheena McMullen, addressing the issue of political will. Was there any data or analysis around the differences or similarities in the public narrative around poverty, or the most effective way in which political or moral will to deliver policy changes that would meaningfully tackle inequalities? So I don't know, again, Helen, that might be a tricky one, or Bertrand, for you, but I wonder, Goretti or Jerome, do you have any sort of sense? Again, I presume when Sheena talks about the narrative around poverty, I mean, does that go to the issue about almost the sympathy that people have for people in situations of poverty, and does it differ on the island of Ireland, or maybe does it differ across Ireland and GB? So I don't know, Goretti or Jerome, any reflections on that one? I know it's a tricky question.
Well, we actually do have some data about people's from the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey about attitudes to poverty and to social security, and actually they have improved considerably since COVID, basically, with people being now much more understanding that social security is necessary, and that is not good enough, and that actually the state ought to provide it, and that they ought to provide it, you know, a better level of social security. So we do have that data. I'll let Jerome come in on the other aspects of it, because I see he was ready to speak, and I've already done a fair bit.
Thanks, Goretti. I think also to get at this, so a very specific example, we take the 2-child limit. I think one of the challenges with that is when you look at the public polling and some of the insight that's been done around the UK, you find the majority are in support of that in England and Scotland, which obviously makes it quite difficult to make the case and win the argument to remove it. When we've done polling with Lucy Tuck in Northern Ireland, what we found is actually the reverse, which we had a sense of, but we're quite surprised of. But actually a majority in Northern Ireland of the population thought it was an unfair policy, they didn't support it, and they wanted to see it removed. And I think that what that's speaking to is the public attitudes question and where people are coming from. And that there are specific contexts in Northern Ireland which you would expect would lead to a different perspective. But I also think it speaks to a wider point about when you're campaigning and advocating on these issues, you're trying to win the support to get political leadership of this. And ultimately, it's either a question of, is there a constituency who's pushing to see this change happen that politicians are working with and supporting? And we did see that around childcare in Northern Ireland recently. I think Melted Parents in particular did an amazing job with that. But what we haven't seen is that kind of despite a lot of really incredible efforts, we haven't seen politicians engage with that in Northern Ireland at a serious level. So we've had a child poverty strategy, which a number of reports showed failed at a number of levels. We are now waiting for an anti-poverty strategy, where there were a lot of challenges in the development of that strategy in terms of the engagement with the community and voluntary sector. We're waiting to see what that strategy will say. But I think like an ongoing concern here, again, is that we just don't see it as a priority among the politicians. There's lots of politicians who care about it and want to see something happen about it, but it's not being prioritized in the way that you see it being done right now in Ireland in terms of the Child Poverty and Wellbeing Unit, in Scotland where it's centred in the programme for government, and even in the UK where the Labour government is developing a child poverty strategy right now. That kind of centering of this as a priority that we want to solve and address, and budget and funding and capacity and time into solving this problem is just not there at the moment and hasn't been there for a long time. And I think that's the big challenge. So when you talk about things like targets, when you talk about things like budget, like ultimately this all hinges on a desire to get this done and to make progress on it. And the real challenge right now is that we're just not seeing that at the level that's needed, given the impact it's having on children, on families and communities.
Great, thanks for that, Jerome. Niall, there's a question from Hugh Fraser that I think you might be best positioned to answer. And Hugh's question, I'll just put this in my own words, I hope Hugh doesn't mind. But basically he was asking, has any difference emerged now between Ireland and Northern Ireland as a result of us still being in the European Union and they're not being in the European Union? Because you make specific reference here, say, to the European Child Guarantee. I mean, are there sort of policy directions coming from Europe that are having a positive impact here that Northern Ireland or United Kingdom more broadly might not be paying as much attention to?
Yeah, I think there's got to be consistently, and there's more opportunities for funding, particularly in to do even just to do research and get the data properly. EU provide different opportunities there. They also provide more guidance to. I know our government will often use EU mechanisms to help them analyse certain policies and to plan for certain policies, but implementation. You know that as well. But I think from my understanding, the EU Child Guarantee is a huge one. We're driving towards 2030 with that, and similarly the Lisbon Treaty, which is supposed to end homelessness, which so we really have targets that may not be there for the British and the devolved states there. So I think there is going to be gaps in that. I think that's only going to grow. It's probably just about starting to see it now. Mitigations may even change that, but for a little while, but I think, yeah, we're going to be driving away from each other soon, I would expect. But it may not, it doesn't, as you can see with some of the figures here, it doesn't guarantee we're going better than them because of that, but we are going to separate in more and more issues, and I can see it with my connections with European colleagues and across the continent. There's a lot of stuff that Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England can't engage with on us because they've been funded by an EU project. So it means that there's lots of different opportunities being lost to do really good work. From both sides, the stuff that I would love to work in cooperation with my colleagues on the British Isles, I can't do it because it's been funded in a certain way, and vice versa. I'm sure there's stuff happening in the British Isles that I can't link with because I'm in the EU. So it's, yeah, I think it's something we really need to talk about and try and get, and again, that's a wider dialogue to have, but yeah, it is happening. I think Ireland at this moment in time is pushing harder because of those two targets, the EU Child Guarantee and the Lisbon Treaty, is going to make a difference in that area.
Okay, I'm looking at my clock. Unfortunately, we've hit 12:30, and we did say we'd end at 12:30. So I think we should do that. There's a number of questions that we haven't been able to get to, but as I said at the outset, we'll try and capture those questions, share them with the panelists, and hopefully there can be some email exchanges on this. So before wrapping things up, can I just sort of say it's been a fascinating morning, actually. Great to have an opportunity to discuss these issues on that all-island basis and to sort of tease out those sort of comparisons and the learnings. So ongoing thanks to the Shared Island Unit in the Department of the Taoiseach for funding this sort of work and facilitating these sort of conversations. I kind of have a sense that there was an awful lot of ground that we had yet to cover, which we've done this once or twice before, that we have done launches, but we've almost sort of relaunched reports in Belfast or possibly elsewhere in Northern Ireland, where we sort of have a follow-up discussion. And it really is a sort of a very fruitful way of thinking about the issues and teasing through them. Anyway, I was eager to thank the Shared Island unit again. I want to thank Niall, Goretti and Jerome for participating in the on the panel. Great contributions from all of you. Helen, Anusha and Bertrand, obviously sort of thanks for being with us today, but more broadly, thanks for a fantastic piece of work. Again, I think lots of comments talking about the report so favorably. So congratulations to you all, and thanks for that. And finally, thanks everybody for logging on this morning, and for those who submitted questions. Great, we got to some of them. Apologies that we didn't get to others, but I sincerely hope you enjoyed the discussion. So with that, draw things to a close, and hopefully we'll see everybody again online or in person before too long. So bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll see you again at something soon, Jerome and Goretti.
Thanks so much, Helen.
Maybe-
Thanks to all the team as well.
Maybe in person next time.
Yeah, maybe. The idea of doing something up here is actually a really good idea, I think.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah. Happy. Well, send us if there's some opportunities or things. Let's share them.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks a
Thank you
million.
so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.